It's my privilege tonight to speak to you about my uncle. He was a pilot in World War II with the 15th Army Air Corps, and I have the privilege of reading, before I knew I was giving this talk, two really good books. One by Stephen Ambrose called The Wild Blue. I highly recommend it. You're welcome to borrow mine. The central reason that Stephen Ambrose wrote this book was because he met a fellow y'all have probably heard of named George McGovern, and learned that George McGovern was a pilot, a B-24 pilot in the 15th Army Air Corps, and so that inspired Ambrose to write this book. Has a lot of stories from McGovern's career as a pilot in World War II. And then the other is a slightly more recent book called The Forgotten 15th by a fellow named Barrett Tillman. And although the 15th, like George McGovern, was a bomber pilot and its primary mission was bombing, Barrett Tillman focuses a lot on the fighters. The fighters were obviously crucial, especially in 1943 and 1944, in eliminating the German Air Force. And he spends a lot of time on that. You're welcome to those. And then I was able to find a book on the 376 Bomb Group, which is what my uncle was in, and it has a mission history of each mission that they flew. So I have the details of every mission, where the pilots were, where the planes were, who the pilots were, and everything. And it was fascinating to find that. This is a picture of my uncle. He was a captain by the time the war was over, and he was born in Birmingham, Alabama. Went to high school in Nashville. Graduated from Hume Fogg High School, and ultimately, when he passed away, he was living in Chattanooga. His name, William McCaja Clark. He and I share our first and last, and his last name, my middle name. It's his father's name, and it's my first two names. He was in the 15th Army Air Corps, the 47th Bomb Wing, the 376 Bomb Group, and the 515th Squadron. And I laughed when I sat with Lit last week. I don't know how in the world he keeps straight all the regiments and where they were placed at the Battle of the Bulge, and I've now experienced that myself, trying to figure out what all these numbers meant in putting this together about my uncle. A little bit of history about my uncle. His father, as I mentioned, died in 1935, and so this is them in their home on Lake Avenue in Knoxville. My mother and their sister. My mother is to the left in this photograph, Muriel, and then my aunt, Betty Ann, is to the right. And Betty Ann is still living. She lives in Knoxville. Uncle Billy would have been 100 years old this year, and my aunt, Betty Ann, is 92. Because he was the son of a father who died in the middle of the Depression, they didn't have much, and so when he went and joined the Army, that was a welcome time for the family, and he ultimately enlisted in to become a pilot school, and received that graduation certificate on January 7, 1944. In the process of going through his letters, which I was able to find, there was this incredible letter from the Army Air Corps to my grandmother, his mother, written before he graduated, that basically says, "Dear Mrs. Clark, we're really glad that your son is trying to be a pilot in the Army, and we appreciate his service, and it looks like he's going to make it. It looks like he's going to pass." So it was before, he had completed it. It was maybe 3 months before, but it was just a nice letter from his commanding officer saying he was doing a good job and encouraging him. I don't know that you'd ever see anything like that today. It was very personal by this commanding officer. So just to set the stage, air power in World War II, certainly many have thought it was decisive, certainly in both Europe and in Japan. Came under a good deal of criticism in the histories in the 80s and 90s in particular, because of the destruction, whether it was all really necessary. General Spaatz was one of the leading spokesmen in the U.S. Army for the American approach to the bombing in Europe, which was to focus on the industrial heart of the German Empire, and in particular the oil refineries and the transportation networks. The British, they just wanted to bomb the Germans to smithereens, and that was probably based in part on what the Germans had done to them in the Blitz. But the Americans, Eisenhower, in his diplomatic way, he said, well, the focus will be transportation targets, and he turned a blind eye when General Spaatz decided that the focus of the 15th Army Air Corps was going to be on oil production. So you all may remember about 5 years ago, Charles Hampton White gave a presentation about Ploiești. And Ploiești, of course, was the big German oil refinery in Romania. And the 15th was the group that launched that attack, and many others on Ploiești. So in assessing the impact of the bombing campaign in Europe, the U.S. conducted a strategic bombing survey, and this is what it concluded: that Allied air power was decisive in the war against Germany. In the air, its victory was complete. At sea, its contribution combined with naval power eliminated the German U-boat threat. On land, it helped turn the tide in favor of Allied ground forces. And additionally, although full effects had not reached the German front lines, it brought about the collapse of the German economy. And certainly that is true in my review of the activities of the 15th in destroying the oil refineries and their ability to produce. And then Albert Speer, the Nazi production chief, wrote that I could see the omens of the war's end almost every day in the southern blue sky when the bombers of the 15th Air Force crossed the Alps from their Italian bases to attack German targets. So there were 4 Army Air Corps in Europe. So the symbol in the upper left-hand corner of this slide is the Air Force symbol itself, the Army Air Corps symbol itself. The 8th is the symbol on the right-hand side, and the 8th is the Army Air Corps most of us know about. It flew primarily out of England after we ran the Germans out of Africa. They moved the 8th to England, and it was the largest of the 4 Army Air Corps during World War II. It was B-17s and B-24s for the most part. It wasn't exclusively 17s and 24s, but mostly. And about 200,000 men served in the 8th, and had about a quarter, about 25% casualty rate, almost 50,000 casualties, and then almost half of those were killed. So almost 1/8 of every man that served in the 8th Army Air Force was killed. Of course, the thing about the bombers is that once it got shot down, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get killed. There are a lot of guys who escaped, but the mortality rate was high. So one of the other Army Air Corps was the 9th. It started in Africa and then was in Italy alongside the 15th for a while, and then to England. And it flew primarily B-26s and A-20s. So it was heavily involved in D-Day and in the invasion as support for the troops as they came in. And then the 12th Army Air Corps also started in Africa, and then it was alongside the 15th in Italy. It was smaller than the 15th. And then finally the 15th was born in 1943. And it was in typical maybe Army fashion, it wasn't all brand new units. They moved units from other Army Air Corps, like the 376 that my uncle was in. It had been bombing and participating for a year and a half when the 15th was born. The first commander of the 15th Army Air Corps was Jimmy Doolittle, who you know from the Doolittle raid earlier in the war. The original concept of the 15th was for the air forces in the south to be able to fly when the weather was bad in the north. And one of the things the 8th experienced and the British experienced obviously too was that when weather was bad over the Channel or other parts of northern Europe, the Germans, weren't getting pounded. And so Eisenhower and others thought, well, let's build some bases in southern Italy and start pounding them from the south. Maybe the weather will be good in the south, even when it's not in the north. Well, Stephen Ambrose in his book makes a big point about how, well, we built these air bases in Italy, and then the weather was terrible. So at the first, anyway, the Italian weather didn't seem to cooperate. But eventually it did, and as Albert Speer noted, the ability of the 15th to humble German targets was great. So the two bombers that were used in the 15th were primarily the exclusively the B-17 and B-24. The B-17 is obviously on the left in this slide, and the B-24 is on the right. My uncle flew a B-24, so I'm focusing on the B-24s tonight. It compared to the B-17, it had a longer range, a higher top speed, and carried a larger and heavier bomb load. Its airspeed was slightly over 300 miles an hour. Its range was over 3,000 miles, and its ceiling was 35,000 feet. Now, the production of the B-24, many of you all probably know, is really a testimony to the fantastic ability of American industry. By March 1944, Ford was rolling off of the assembly lines a new, ready-to-go B-24 every 100 minutes. Every 100 minutes, a new bomber was rolling off the lines, ready to go. Really fantastic. Now, the loss rate, I mentioned earlier, the loss rate of the men was high. About 1/8 of the flyers were killed that were serving. Well, the loss rate of planes was even higher. I don't have the statistics on that, but I can tell you from reviewing the records of the missions, it was unusual not to lose at least one bomber in a mission, even if the crew was able to bail out. So it was good that Ford was churning out those bombers. They needed them. Now, the Army Air Corps, the 15th, was made up of 5 bomb wings, the 5th, 47th, 49th, 55th, and 304th. And my uncle was in the 47th bomb wing, and that included 4 bomb groups, one of which was the 376th, and then each of those bomb groups had 4 squadrons. So it was a big organization. In addition to the bomb groups, it had an OSS wing, an intelligence wing, 2 fighter wings. You may have seen or heard of the movie about the Tuskegee Airmen. They were in the 15th and in the 376th bomb group. Had a photo reconnaissance group and a weather squadron. Of the bombers in the 15th, 2/3 were B-24s. So about 3,500 were B-24s and about 1,400 were B-17s. Of the B-24s, basically half were shot down. 1,756 B-24s out of 3,500 were shot down. So I do have the statistic after all. The B-17s, it was almost half, 45%. So obviously, this was a dangerous job. Now, the 376 bomb group, and that's the emblem for the 376 in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, was the first B-24 group based in Europe. It had 4 distinguished unit citations, 1 for its service in North Africa, 1 for Sicily, 1 for Ploesti, and 1 for Bratislava in Czechoslovakia. The B-24 crews made up of 10 men, 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. The photograph on the right is of one of the planes that my uncle flew, and those are 2 fellows that he knew. I've seen them both referenced in his letters, and those are the captains of other craft, Mansell and Duncan. The officers were a pilot and a co-pilot, a navigator and a bombardier, and 6 enlisted men, an engineer, radio operator, and then 4 gunners, 1 for the nose, 1 for the tail, and 2 waist gunners. This is my uncle's crew. He is the one in the back row on the far left. I assume his co-pilot, Paul DeWoody, is the person to his left, and I assume the other two men are standing where the other officers, and that the men seated in front are the enlisted men. I don't know. There is a website set up by the fellows from the 376th, and they did have these statistics, so I do have these guys' names. I have been looking for this information for years, and they started putting this up a couple of years ago. I learned in the last few months, and was delighted to find it, obviously. This is Europe at the time, and I've got a little brown dot there where the air base was that the 376 flew out of. It was called San Pangrazio Airfield. Foggia is the other airfield, you may have heard of it, that the 15th flew out of. The pilots and crews basically stayed together. Now obviously there would be substitution, as needed, but all the records are kept by the name of the pilot. So if you're looking for in your family to find out where maybe an enlisted man or another officer served, you'd want to find the name of the pilot. The pilots and the crews flew many different bombers. I had this notion that you basically had your own plane and so forth. No, they're flying a different plane every day. My uncle flew 51 missions, and I think the most he ever flew one plane was four times one plane. And then I thought all the bombers had the art on the front, like the art in this particular slide, but that's not the case. I'd say maybe 15%, 15 to 20% had the art. So I thought I'd show a few of the bombers that, well, actually all the bombers that I was able to find that there were photographs of that my uncle flew. Incredibly, I actually have a photograph of him with his head sticking out of the pilot's window of that same craft we saw earlier, the Badger Beauty, and that's my uncle in the picture there, Bill Clark. And there's another shot of that same airplane. And he flew this plane too, Der Flittermaus, and he also flew, there's a very fine rendering of this particular plane, the Winch. The 376 flew 450 missions, about 150 before the 15th was created, and then another 300 after the 15th was created. The first mission by the 376 was against Ploeshti in June of 1942. In that mission, the 376 had 13 bombers participate, and 5 of them were shot down. On the 150th mission, which was the first mission as part of the 15th, it was also over Ploeshti. We had 27 bombers from the 376 in that encounter, and 4 were shot down. As I mentioned, the targets were oil production and transportation targets were always a top priority for the 15th. That was the influence of General Spaatz. And by 1943 and 44, during 43 and 44, Ploeshti and the Balkan areas were the primary targets. Now the Soviets overran Ploeshti in August of 1944. And so at that time, they reported that the bombing missions had been very effective because the refinery was useless when the Russians took it. So after the Soviets took Ploeshti in August of 1944, the focus shifted then to the industrial targets in Germany and Austria. And the primary target for the 376th anyway was Vienna and Munich. And I learned in this process that Vienna was one of the most, well, it and Berlin were the most heavily guarded targets in Europe, which I just didn't know. Vienna was called Flak Alley, and this is actually a photograph of a B-24 that was hit during a run over Vienna. These are the records that I was able to locate of my uncle's missions, and I've highlighted in red the missions over Vienna, as you can see. And this is one of the planes that he flew over Vienna, and I'm actually going to read you an excerpt of a letter that he wrote about one of those missions. So why was Vienna such a difficult target? Well, the Nazis built these flak forts or flak castles in Berlin, in Hamburg, and in Vienna. There were 6 in Berlin, there were 2 in Hamburg, and there were 6 in Vienna. And they were, you know, the Germans are pretty clever when it comes to engineering. They would build them in pairs so that we'd have cross-fire communications between the 2 castles. And they were imposing monsters on the ground for these guys. In addition, in Vienna, there were over 300 fighters that defended the airs in Vienna for the Nazis. The flak towers could put out 8,000 rounds per minute per flak tower. So it was pretty deadly monsters. And they are all still standing in Vienna. They are ginormous pieces of concrete, and the Austrians have not figured out how to take them down. So they've converted a couple of them. One of them is an aquarium. One of them is some other sort of public space. But they're huge buildings in Vienna. The ones in Vienna had 8 128 millimeter anti-aircraft cannons each. So you can imagine the dreaded 88s were what the bomber pilots feared the most. An 128 millimeter anti-aircraft cannon is considerably larger than an 88 and put up some pretty bad flak. These towers all had retractable radar, so the radar mechanism would be out to detect the approaching bombers, and then it would retract before our guys got there behind concrete shields, so the radar itself couldn't be damaged. And as I mentioned, all the ones in Vienna are still standing. So Vienna is, was called Flak Alley and was infamous to our flyers. And as I mentioned, I'm going to read you an excerpt from a letter my uncle wrote. And I chose it because, A, he's the topic for tonight, but it's also beautifully written. I almost read you one of an even more harrowing character by another one of the officers who was on a plane flown by Bishop that was shot down. And it's more entertaining probably than my uncle's, because my uncle's was written to his mother. So you can imagine, in writing a letter to his mom, he's going to hold a few punches. Whereas Mr. William Davis, who wrote the other letter that I would have read to you instead, it was written after the war without any censors and without, the fear of making his mother afraid, I guess. So the target that day, as I mentioned, well, let's talk about Vienna, the targets in Vienna. There's 7 oil refineries in the Vienna vicinity, which just, I couldn't believe. I was so surprised when I learned that. There were also numerous factories, tank factories, engine factories, and of course by late 1944, it was mostly repair facilities. We were knocking things out so quickly that the Germans were trying to repair things more than maybe build them. Numerous rail yards. The most famous was the Wiener Neustadt rail yards. The Hinkel aircraft plant was there. The jets that the Nazis built, some of them were built in Vienna, and actually some of them were in the craft that were sent up against our guys in early 1945. And this, on the day of the mission, I'm going to read you the letter that my uncle wrote, was that the destination. This is an actual photograph of the Libau oil storage facility they were bombing that was taken during the mission, with the notations in the lower right-hand corner by the mission photographer about what it showed. On the mission that day, 2 of our B-24s were shot down. So I'm going to read you from this letter. I'm not going to expect you to read that, obviously, and I'm going to have some footage of missions flown by the 376, some of which were over Vienna, with some stills that were over Vienna. Hopefully it will be playing while I'm reading this. So this is a letter to my grandmother dated August 27, 1944. Would you like to go with me on a raid? Of course, being a 4-mission veteran, I'm able to speak with anything but export authority. But without trying to be an authority, let me describe a sortie and how it feels to go on a raid. It's the night before, and the bulletin board has announced the fact that there is to be a combat mission tomorrow. I eagerly scan the list of pilots and ships to see if we are included, and sure enough, there it is. I go over to the tent occupied by the enlisted boys, and they've already seen the board. The air is heavy with speculation as to what it will be like, how tough the target will be. Then I give a few brief instructions as to the early morning schedule, admonishing them to get a little sleep. It's about 9:30 p.m., so I'd better head to bed also. At 2:30, the shrill blast from the sergeant's whistle rudely shatters the peaceful slumber, and sleepy hands fumble for a candle. Promptly at 3:15, the truck pulls away from operations office, carrying us to our briefing room. The target, we're told, is an oil storage plant near Vienna. The area has been bombed several times, so much information is available. The flak will be undoubtedly heavy, and there's a good chance we'll see fighters. Are my hands sweaty because of the heat? The air is foul, with many cigarettes being lighted by many hands as the briefing continues. The route out, the route back, rendezvous points, formation assembly, emergency procedures, target pictures, bombing altitude and direction. It drones on and on until 4:30, and we load up in the trucks again. Our gunners are already at the airplane when we arrive and are busy checking guns and ammunition. I make a pre-flight inspection of the ship, don my clothes, flying veil, fur jacket, heavy boots, and so forth. I brief them quickly on the fighters to be expected and general flight procedures, answering any questions left unanswered in their own briefing. On the way out, a ship accompanies us known as the Hickle ship. He bitches at the formation, correcting ships out of position and generally getting into everyone's hair. Finally, he turns back with a cheery, "Good luck, fellas." We're not in the enemy territory yet, and there are a few things to be done. Fuel must be transferred from auxiliary to main tanks. Guns must be unlumbered and test fired. The engines must be watched closely. For if you have any ailment, it's time now to find out before you contact the enemy. We're climbing all the way. At 10,000 feet, the bombardier calls the crew and orders oxygen masks. On up we climb. We're going high today, well over 20,000 feet. It begins to get cold as we reach the higher strata of thin air, but the flight deck, we're lucky because we have heaters. In the turrets, they have to turn on their electric suits. Now we're a matter of hours out of base and have crossed into enemy territory. Occasionally I sneak a look. Funny, down there, it looks like just any other place from this high up, very quiet and peaceful. But up here, death rides the sky. It's a thrilling sight. We're flying in the third wave and we can see dozens of other ships stretching powerfully ahead of the target. I should imagine a most unpleasant sight for those below. We're only 30 minutes from the target now and deep in the fighter belt. My eyes roam the sky keenly. Then, like a swarm of bees, enemy fighters are met by P-38s. They're here to see that Jerry has his hands too full to fight with us big boys. I can't repress a smile and a feeling of relief and gratitude for those P-38s. The target is 10 minutes away. The engineer steps up with flak helmets and suits to help us get them on. The formation is tight, nerves tighter. The air only a while ago was filled with plane-to-plane chatter. It's still now, charged with excitement. The drone of the engines becomes part of me, hunched over the wheel, shrouded in my helmet and coat of steel. The target's ahead. I cannot see it. A heavy black cloud has appeared over it. A cloud of small black dots that mushroom all over the sky, and suddenly, menacing, my God, I say to myself, are we going to fly through that? I heave a sigh of relief as we turn into the target run, but the cloud's still there. Black puffs of smoke appear ahead. Fly formation, I scream at myself. Thwump, thwump. You can hear it burst near you. Then a sudden tearing sound, a piece of flak tears through the skin of the ship. Well, I say, that's one. Didn't bother to wonder where it was. Bombs away, and the deadly missiles are unerringly dispatched to the target. The formation makes a turn. The flak is left behind, and we're on our way home. Pilot to crew, everybody okay? The crew reports okay. Soon the formation is closed up again. Oftentimes, planes are struggling to keep up with one or more engines out, and the well ones slow up to take care of the sick. And so it's over. The only thing ahead is the long haul back home. It's a long, nerve-wracking trail of heavies that takes their heavy toll on the Hun all over Europe. That's part of it. There's more detail than secrecy prevents my passing on, but maybe I've conveyed a small portion of the mighty punch we're throwing and the powerful surge of excitement with each one. Let's not try to fool ourselves. Crews and planes go down, and it's no pleasant sight to see a big hefty cruiser like an old B-24 all of a sudden go weak and have to drop out of this fight. But it's accepted as a fact and treated as such, not at all lightly, regretfully, but with a quiet reserve known only to the men who fight. And when it's all over, we lay tired in our cots and give a whispered prayer of thanks to our Father God, who has seen fit to grant the request whispered in the cockpit just before takeoff. O God, our Father, who guideth the flight of the sparrow and eagle alike, grant us this day a cool head, a steady hand, and a heart of courage, that, if it be thy will, we may complete this mission well and safely, through Christ our Lord. Amen. So that was early on in my uncle's 51 missions that he flew. And you'll see these are all the missions that he flew over Vienna. They obviously spent a lot of time pounding on Vienna. I thought I'd mention how these boxes were set up at this time. The boxes were always different as the war went on and we got more and more planes. They got bigger. But at this time in August of 1944, there were 7 planes in a box. So like on this particular mission, Box C would be the 3rd box in the group, and this is the layout. So Mr. Camp's, his plane was in the front, my uncle's was the one back behind his to the left, Mr. Bishop's was to the right of that, and then 4 planes behind it. And you'll see some names there that you've seen before in the pictures of the planes that they flew. Now the reason I have Camp's and Bishop in red in this slide is because those 2 planes were shot down. This is the crew of the Bishop's plane. Unfortunately, everyone in Camp's plane perished. The Bishop's plane, James Bishop was the pilot. He was 19 years old, and they had 2 engines knocked out in the flak attack. They had a 3rd engine go out before they got to the Yugoslavian border. They had that engine completely go out over the Adriatic Sea, and they had to ditch in the Adriatic. He landed the plane safely in the Adriatic. Nobody was hurt. Everybody but him got out of the plane quickly. They discovered that he was not out. 2 of the men dove in after him. He was still strapped in his harness underwater. They were able to cut that harness and get him out. He was unconscious. An Italian fishing vessel came along. They got him on that little fishing vessel, and giving him artificial respiration, he came to. And so everybody in this photograph survived. Bishop is the one in red on the right, and Davis is the one in blue on the left, the author of this fantastic recount of that mission. But all those guys were on that same mission, and my uncle, of course, didn't mention a word about the 2 planes, the one ahead of him and the one to his right getting shot down right in front of him. Of course, like I said, it was a letter to his mom. So you can understand that, I guess. My uncle, I could tell from the letters, was good friends with Bishop, the pilot of this plane. And when he was still 19 years old, Bishop became a captain even before my uncle did. My uncle was 27. They both were captains by the end of the war, but it's quite a testament to that young man and what a great pilot he was. Uncle's last mission was on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1945. It was on Vienna, so he flew against Vienna quite a bit. There's some incredible footage that we happen to have in my family, which is hard to believe, of my uncle coming home from the war. That's my mom running up to greet him. My dad undoubtedly was taking this, and that's his mom, my grandmother. And then on the far side is his other sister, Betty Ann. That's at the Knoxville airport in March 1945. So I thought it was sort of interesting. I noticed at CVS this week, I picked up a Life magazine that's called, Heroes of World War II or something like that. And in reading through my uncle's letters, I came across this one about, our celebration of heroism. And don't get me wrong, I'm all about it. I think it's great. We celebrate what all you guys did over there fighting the Nazis and the Japs. I'm glad of it. But I thought my uncle's thoughts about it were interesting because he was in the middle of it, you know, and this, to me, reflected the attitude of the men that I learned, we grew up with as a young man, that nobody would talk about the war, ever, and certainly nobody ever bragged or acted like they did anything significant, which just blew my mind because to me it was very significant. So this is what he wrote. In response to a letter from his aunt, Aunt Helen, who had said that she was proud of him and glad he was out fighting our battles. We're glad the folks at home are proud and think kindly of us for fighting the battles, but we would like to see a little less drum beating because we don't beat drums over here. It's just plain old hard work, and we don't go around patting ourselves on the back for saving the world or anybody else. We know that there's no excuse for war, but we also know that it must be fought in order to have any kind of security, at least in the balance of our lifetimes. I wish I could make speeches and really be able to tell the folks who cannot be over here, frankly and honestly, how a guy feels over here. Most of all, he wants to go home and find the home as nearly like it as it was when he left, as much as possible. He knows it cannot ever be the same, but that is his dream nevertheless. So it's no wonder that he and others, you know, never talked about the war when they came home, despite being pestered by their little nephew to always talk about it. And sure enough, I pestered him about it. I always wanted to know about it. And you know, he never talked about it until about 3 days before he died. He died in 1998, and I went down to see him in Chattanooga. And he told me about going over a mission, undoubtedly Vienna, where the flak was bad and how scared he was and how much he hated it. And he hated war. He hated that he was having to do it. And so it's no wonder, you know, he didn't talk about it. It's no wonder at all. So my mom made this little case of the medals and so forth. But that's where the picture is that I found. And of course, he never mentioned this, but those airmen in the crowd may know that that's a Distinguished Flying Cross in the upper right-hand corner of that box. And that's an award given by the Army, or medal given by the Army for heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. So, you know, he never mentioned it. I have no idea what it was that led to receiving this, but it's in that box that I've had in our family my whole life. Now, my uncle died in 1988. He was 71 at the time. He worked in the coal business through the 1950s and early 60s, and then he worked for the Coca-Cola company down in Chattanooga. My uncle is probably unique in this group to anybody else, and lived in a way that at the time certainly was in the shadows. He was a gay man, and he never was able to tell anybody about it, talk about it. It was never a subject of discussion in our household. It was not to be discussed. And I consulted with one of my friends who is known in this way about whether I should speak about it tonight. And he thought that I should. And because my uncle never was able to talk about it. He was never able to be himself. He was never able to share the kind of life and discussion in a complete way like we can. And I never really knew to be able to talk to him about it myself, right, before he died. It was not like it is today, whether it's more accepted. So I certainly wish it had been, and I'm certainly proud of and love my uncle immensely. And I'm honored to have shared his story with you tonight. Thank you.